Hello, Mr. Philip Campbell here, and this is lecture number 5 for the honors course in my class Modern American History 1865 to 2000, in which we talk about the era of Woodrow Wilson in the second decade of the 20th century. And wanted to talk a little bit about central banking because in the lecture I mentioned the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. Want to give a little bit more background on central banking in the United States and how we got the Federal Reserve and its importance. So, central banking in the U.S. What is a central bank? A central bank is essentially a private bank that operates in the interest of the U.S. government, that does things like issues currency, provides loans to the government, and has the authority to regulate the activities of state and local banks. We had a central bank at the founding of our republic, the first Bank of the United States, which was pushed by Alexander Hamilton. It was in operation from 1791 to 1811 when its charter expired, and then we got the second Bank of the United States. This is the central bank that famously was opposed by Andrew Jackson. Jackson and many of the Western frontier Democrats believed that the central bank favored the moneyed elites of the urbanized East, and that it was a danger to the average American. And Jackson had pledged in his presidential campaign to destroy the bank, which he did. He defunded the Second Bank of the United States in 1833, removing all federal deposits and essentially wiping out the bank. So from 1833 on, for 80 years, the United States had no central bank. Essentially, state and local banks would issue their own currencies, which circulated alongside gold currency, like gold coins, and silver coinage. That is until the Coinage Act of 1873 eliminated silver currency. And after 1873, the United States was placed simply on the gold standard. And then you also had the federal government, from the time of the Civil War under Lincoln, was issuing a currency called the greenback. So there's all these different currencies, the gold, silver, the greenback, the bank currencies that were being issued. In certain areas, even companies could issue currency, like if you lived in a remote area where there was maybe one large mining company that dominated the town, that mining company might issue its own currency that was only good in that town. So there's all sorts of different currencies going around. And this was okay as long as we were still in mainly an agricultural phase of our national development. But once we got into the latter 19th and early 20th century, into the age of big industry and big finance, this situation created a time of great financial instability. You had recessions and bank panics really throughout the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th. So you had either a recession or a panic in 1873, 1882, 1890, 1893, 1896, 1899, 1902, 1907, and 1910. It was just a slew of recessions, bank panics, and financial problems. Now, there's various reasons for this. Lack of supervision over individual banks. There were runs on the gold supply. Reckless overextensions of credit, because without regulation, these banks could put out as many loans as they wanted or print as much currency as they wanted. There was also the powerful influence of railroads and finance in the economy. So a lot of individuals started arguing for a financial, like a monetary reform of the country. And one of the things they argued for was the recreation of a central bank that would stabilize the economy during periods of recession, financial panic, by providing a reserve of liquid assets, and also regulating credit, regulating these state and local banks, and also reforming our currency laws. One of the driving reformers of the American financial system was Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island. He came up with a plan in a secret meeting at a place called Jekyll Island in Georgia with a bunch of other lawmakers and financiers, people from big finance, came up with this idea for essentially what he called a national reserve system, a national reserve association. This was going to be essentially a central bank with that was made up of a bunch of regional banks that would print money and act as a fiscal agent for the United States government. But it would have very little government oversight. It would essentially be an independent central bank, kind of turning the nation's monetary policy over to the free market under the auspices of this bank. This proposal, this was during the closing years of the Taft administration. This was very unpopular in the South and in the West. The central banks, central banking had always been very unpopular in the rural areas. And it was the same arguments that Jackson had brought forth against the central bank, that it was going to benefit only the big financiers of places like Chicago and New York. It was going to be dominated by elites who were going to manipulate the currency in their own interest and take advantage of the little guy, etc. Now, in 1912, the Democrats took power. They swept Congress, and they came into the White House with the Woodrow Wilson administration. The Democrats were opposed to the Aldrich Plan, but they still wanted currency reform, and so what they did was they started modifying Aldrich's National Reserve Association, and they tacked on more government oversight. Nelson Aldrich's plan had the private bank printing money, but now under the new plan, the U.S. Treasury would print the money, but these would be bills printed on debt issued by the new central bank, so they'd be backed by the central bank. And membership of state and local banks, if they wanted a national charter, it was going to be mandatory to participate, to be a member in this new reserve system, whereas the previous plan had that as optional. And so this was all packaged together as the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, and it was signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson, and that's how we got the Federal Reserve System that we have today, which handles the nation's monetary policy, decides how much money we have in circulation, controls interest rates, regulates the actions of member banks, etc. The Federal Reserve remains controversial, and there's many reasons for it. Many people say, for example, that Congress is not able to fulfill its constitutional duty to regulate the money supply, because with the control of the money supply being turned over to the Fed, Congress has forfeited its own ability to regulate that supply. And people say, can that be delegated? Can it not be delegated? Many people say that the recessions we've had since 1913 have all been more severe, and that this is because of the Fed's monetary policy. So people argue, does the Federal Reserve make things better? Does it make things worse? It's definitely the longest we've ever gone with a central bank. Until the Federal Reserve Act, we'd never gone longer than 25 years with a central bank. The Federal Reserve Act is also what allowed the United States dollar to become a global currency, and people debate whether that's a good thing or not. But anyhow, this is some background to how we got the Federal Reserve, why the progressives in the early 20th century wanted to put us back on a central banking system. One other subject I want to mention about this decade is the first Red Scare. Now, when we think about the Red Scare, that is paranoia about communist infiltration, we often think of the 1950s and Senator Joseph McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee hearings in the 50s and 60s, but I'm actually talking about the first Red Scare, which was after World War I in 1919 to 1920, immediately after the Russian Revolution. So to put this into context, the Russian Revolution had occurred in 1917 when the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar. And the Bolsheviks had immediately withdrawn Russia from World War I, and then by 1919 they'd really consolidated their power. Now, the United States government saw a correlation between the Bolshevik Revolution and the U.S. labor movement for a couple reasons. Number one, remember that Bolshevik communism as an ideology is a global ideology. They didn't just say this is for Russia. They believed in exporting the revolution worldwide. So this obviously has to be a concern, a security concern for any nation. But secondly, remember the Bolsheviks in Russia had begun as a labor movement. The Soviet Union, the word Soviet, it means a workers' council. These Soviets began as workers' councils in Russian cities. So the Bolshevik Revolution started as a labor movement. So because of this, the U.S. government naturally started to worry that perhaps there was a correlation between the way the Bolshevik Revolution had unfolded in Russia and the way the labor movement in the United States was unfolding in the early 20th century. And they started worrying about communist infiltration into the labor movement. So in February of 1919, the Senate created this subcommittee called the Overman Committee, and the Overman Committee was a five-man subcommittee, and it was charged with investigating Russian collusion into the United States labor movement, especially the unions, and investigating any attempts to plot to overthrow the United States government. So the committee did all this investigation into Russian collusion, and they reported back to the Senate that collusion was rampant in the union movement, and that a communist threat against the very fabric of the United States, against the United States government itself, was imminent, that we were in imminent danger of a communist overthrow. So now, to be fair, this wasn't entirely imagined, because throughout the spring of 1919 there was a string of anarchist bombings, and the anarchist movement was often lumped in with the communist movement. They had some overlap, but through April to June of 1919 there was all these bombings done by anarchists. And remember, the last presidential assassination before this was that of William McKinley in 1901. He was shot by an anarchist. So the threat of anarchist/communist violence was real, not imagined. The Attorney General at the time was A. Mitchell Palmer, and he responded to the Overman Committee report with exaggerated rhetoric, a warning about communist infiltration, Russian collusion from foreigners. There was a lot of what would now be considered illegal searches and seizures, unwarranted arrests, and even deportation of socialists and leftists within the country. All leftists were stigmatized. Socialists, unionists, political reformers, certain progressives, especially socialists who, like their May Day demonstrations. The socialists in the United States would typically have demonstrations in major cities on May Day, which was May 1st, and these could often turn into street brawls. So socialists were especially targeted as suspects of Russian collusion. But also blacks, because 1919 was a record year for race riots in the United States. There was race riots in all sorts of major cities, Chicago and Tulsa, northern cities, southern cities, very, very tense, violent racial atmosphere. And the Senate reports on this said that the communists were stirring up the Negroes to revolution, and there was this huge scare that the communists were actively proselytizing among the segregated black population of the country to stage a communist uprising. In short, every social disturbance was blamed on communist infiltration, and it reached a sort of fever pitch, a sort of national hysteria, paranoia, from 1919 going into 1920, and to the point where people's civil liberties were really violated with unwarranted arrests, illegal searches, deportations, and it was justified in the name of national security. That is how a lot of these violations of civil liberties always get justified as security. It did finally end in 1920. Attorney General Palmer had claimed that he had evidence of a massive communist insurgency nationwide that was going to be planned for May Day of 1920, which is May 1st, that on that day there was going to be massive civil disturbances by coordinated communist groups across the country, and the National Guard was alerted and law enforcement was alerted, and everybody was waiting for this big communist insurgency. And then May 1st, 1920 came and nothing really happened. The day passed without any trouble. And it kind of made Palmer look silly, and people started to say, you know what, this is a little bit overblown. And yeah, it was overblown. There was never, yes, do communists in general target the labor movement? Certainly. Did they try to win blacks to their cause? Certainly. But was there any evidence of Russian collusion? No. There was never any substantial evidence that the Russians had infiltrated the United States and were plotting a coordinated communist coup against the United States government. It was simply hysteria. And Americans seemed to, I don't know, the Russians seem to be the boogeyman. Every couple generations they come back and we're worried about Russian collusion and infiltration. It's interesting how history repeats itself. But anyways, that's the first Red Scare from 1919 to 1920.